Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kaiden Corkill. This is Planning Expectations for Disaster Recovery. To give you a little background on myself, I have been with Network Center for about a year and a half now. I started in April of 2019. I have an undergraduate degree in Network and Security Administration, as well as a master's degree in Information Assurance and Computer Security. On top of that, I have a Network Plus certification, and recently, a pretty big milestone for me was getting my Ethical Hacker certification. That was actually just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, so that's been a pretty proud moment of mine. But now that we've got some of my arrogance out of the way, we can move into the fun stuff. And I know that when everybody sees these words, business continuity and disaster recovery, the first thing that comes to their mind is fun. A little sarcasm there. Some people might think that these two items are one and the same. They might have heard the acronym BCDR, kind of combining the two of them, but they are different. They accomplish different goals under the same umbrella of contingency planning. But business continuity planning is specifically targeting business functionality. So it doesn't necessarily have an IT focus, but is more focused on the business as a whole and how the business will continue to operate during and after an event has occurred. Typically, these kinds of events are not critical or not catastrophic, I would say. They don't typically have extended impact. So like 30 days or less would be kind of an expectation for a business continuity plan to be enacted. Whereas a disaster recovery plan is going to have a lot more detail focused specifically in the IT world and how to recover some of the infrastructure that may have been impacted or critical assets supporting the business functions from the business continuity plan. And typically this is a catastrophic event, so something that would have severe impact to the environment with extended stay for more than 30 days, potentially full loss of a building, full loss of infrastructure, and how the organization plans to actually overcome those issues. Things like this could be, large natural disasters. A major flood comes in and impacts the physical location of your business. What are the plans for recovering that? Is it waiting for a new building to be put in place, or do you have alternate sites to fall over to and kind of recover operations from there? Um, like I said, both of these are under the umbrella of contingency planning, but they are not the only contingency plans that exist. There are many, many forms of contingency planning, and it's not all specifically IT focused. Most of it actually has focus on the business as a whole. And that's something that I think has been pretty well emphasized throughout most of the presentations today, is that security is not an IT focus, but is a business focus, right? Security can affect the entire business operation, and it should be approached from that kind of a perspective. So what some of these different plans might accomplish apart from business continuity and disaster recovery is general business resumption in the event of a small scale outage. So you maybe have a single server that's been dropped, and how do you plan on actually resuming business in the event of that occurring? How quickly can you get back online? It doesn't have to be IT focused for a business resumption plan, but there will be aspects of IT that are addressed in these plans here. Continuity of support plan. So when the infrastructure goes down for your IT help desk to properly manage your infrastructure, what is the plan there? How are you going to continue support operations during some sort of an event? Having that plan outlined is going to make things run much more smoothly. Um, Additionally, there are things like a crisis communication plan. So how does a business actually plan to communicate during some of these events? What are the main communication channels that will be used, main individuals or points of contact for all aspects of a business that would be affected in some sort of an event like this? Something that this graphic, I think, identifies very well is that you have the organization in the center, and all of these procedures and plans and policies are kind of on the outside that gives that umbrella effect that I'm trying to go for here. All of these should be protecting the organization in the event of a storm, right? If you're out in the rain, having these plans would kind of prevent you from getting a little wet there. Um, and one of the big questions that I think almost everyone asks when they see some of these things, contingency planning topics, is why. But why does my organization need to have these plans, even if we're a small organization? Why do we need to have a disaster recovery plan or a continuity plan? Nothing's happened before. Why expect it to happen in the future? Well, again, as I think almost everybody today has outlined and almost any security professional will explain, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when an event like this will affect your organization. And this nice little stock image here outlines in simple words. You hope for the best. You hope that nothing will happen to your organization or your business, but you plan for the worst, because when things hit the fan, ultimately it's better to have that plan and be prepared than to try and scramble and come up with the appropriate actions to take. If you have everything outlined for what would happen or what the organization needs to do in those events, you can minimize downtime that would be caused by a major event. You can minimize the impact that that event would have, maximize your efficiency in the recovery process, right? So these are typically very intense situations, very high stress, and the people involved with them are exactly that. They are people, right? So nobody's perfect, and when you're under stress and in these high intensity situations, having that plan or direct checklist that you can walk through and make sure that you're following exact direction to properly restore a system or bring the environment back to functionality, that is absolutely valuable and very important to have. Um, Additionally, you can avoid unexpected costs that would result from a large event or even a small event. During the process of planning for contingency measures, you will identify what the expected costs would be during certain scenarios, and you can put into place some financial resources ahead of time. So, there might not be a way to completely avoid financial cost or financial loss in some scenarios, but you can at least anticipate it and expect it and be ready for that, so it's not a major impact financially. But additionally, um, events and security incidents, breaches, however you want to go about labeling it, they always come with a level of reputational impact as well, both internally and externally, right? So if you're a customer-facing business, which pretty much everything in the world is, there are people that look to you to have certain standards. And if your business goes down for an extended period of time and you're not able to offer the appropriate services, or if your business is breached and customer personal information is leaked to the public, that can drastically impact your reputation as a business in a way that might not be recoverable. So having plans for business continuity and business contingency, recovery, incident response, having plans drawn out for how to respond to certain scenarios and events will absolutely minimize the impact that can happen to the business's reputation. But it's also not just external reputation that you have to kind of consider in this situation. You also have to consider the reputation from your employees, right? If the business is down for an extended period of time, they're unable to work and have all of these additional stressors trying to assist in properly implementing this plan. Those employees are also going to start looking down on the company in a way that isn't good for morale or the business process going forward. So it's very important to have a plan for many reasons. Just a simple example from my personal life, actually. This isn't IT related, but recently I had moved to Colorado, and this was a big change from the Great Plains up in the Dakotas. One of the things that I had not expected or planned for or anticipated in any way was the wildfires that are occurring right now. The Cameron Peak fire, which got very close to my home, is the largest in Colorado history, and there were evacuation orders within 5 minutes of my residence. Me and the roommates had not anticipated this in any way. We had no plan of action, and in the middle of the night, we started getting text messages for voluntary evacuations in our area. Had we had a plan, we might have been in a little bit of a better scenario, but instead, we, in the middle of the night, started packing bags and kind of preparing our vehicles for the event of a mandatory evacuation to leave the area. So contingency planning kind of occurs in our day-to-day lives in ways that we don't necessarily think about, maybe not as detailed as we do in the business world, but everybody kind of has some familiarity with what it means to be prepared for events like this. Having a backup plan is always valuable. Um, and so this is where we're going to kind of get into what the planning process actually looks like and what you can expect to accomplish as you walk through it. Ultimately, these will be kind of the process that you should follow as far as step 1, 2, 3, but they can be kind of interchanged, as you saw with the diagram for all of the different policies. It's not a step-by-step portion there. They are supporting documentation, right? So you might develop a disaster recovery plan as you're also walking through your business continuity plan. You might be developing the crisis communications plan as you're walking through the other ones, right? So this process does apply to everything, but you might kind of move things around or do things simultaneously when you're creating these plans and these policies. But the first thing in my mind is always establish what the policy is for the organization. So if there is a requirement for a disaster recovery plan, there should be a policy that enforces that within the organization. And these are the specific things that those policies should kind of identify at a very high level. Getting into the difference between a policy and a plan and procedures is kind of out of the scope here, but ultimately, a policy is high level and should cover the entire organization. So in the instance of a disaster recovery policy, you would want to identify at a high level all of the roles within the organization that would be included and what some of their responsibilities might be. So, for instance, you could include security operations manager, and their responsibility would be coordinating the recovery efforts, coordinating the response plan, kind of high level things like that to identify exactly what part they would play. But it also isn't just security roles and responsibilities. It's going to be regular employees, other management, so HR responsibilities. It's going to kind of incorporate all areas of the business, because ultimately that's what this policy should be supporting, is the business, not just the IT department or just the security department. It supports the business as a whole. From there, you'll also identify at a high level the scope as far as business functions that this should be covering. So if you're a business that has a retail website, that would be the business function is your retail store. And the critical assets there might be a web server that you host internally, right? Those would be items that should be kind of identified at a high level. So business function, and then some IT assets that might support that business function. Resources that are required for the policy to actually be effective. These could be financial resources, technological resources, or support individuals. Anything that would be required for this policy to properly function. Again, high level, so we don't want to say something really detailed like this domain controller is going to be required for whatever purpose, right? We want it to be more high level, a little bit closer to, we would anticipate backups being necessary for a recovery procedure, kind of just general items that are going to be needed for the function there. Defining and requiring training within the organization is going to be very critical for any plan to properly take place. If the employees aren't properly educated in what their roles would be within the plan, then it's not going to be a very effective plan, right? And that falls in line with testing the plan. Both of these should be on a periodic schedule to ensure consistency. And testing should have some defined criteria, right? So if we do tabletop readings of the plan and just walk through the general steps with the teams, or are we doing live demonstrations where we have a demo environment that's been compromised in some way, and we want to test the restore procedures directly there. Require a regular review of the plan to make sure that as changes in the environment come into place, we are updating the plan, because if we aren't incorporating all aspects of the business into the plan and the policy, it's not going to operate effectively. And so in here, we would also want to specify some of our requirements for backups, not necessarily detailed as far as what system is going to get backed up or what service we would utilize, but more at a high level that they are required at a defined schedule, identified in, you can reference supporting documentation here as well. So if you have actual procedures or policies that maybe go a little bit more low level, you can absolutely reference those within this as well. A business impact analysis should absolutely be conducted as you walk through some of the planning processes here. And this is where you're going to be able to identify critical IT resources as far as physical infrastructure that is required for business purposes. So if, like I said, you are hosting a website, and one of the dependencies for that website is a physical server that would be identified in this plan, you would then identify how impactful a disruption to that dependency would be. If that device is brought offline for a day, is that a critical impact? Are you losing significant amounts of data or financial resources, or is it going to be more of a low impact? We have minimal things on the website. It's more for information for customers. Maybe it doesn't actually provide a business service there, right? So assigning the appropriate value based on certain criteria for the impact is going to be necessary in the BIA. You will define an acceptable downtime for those, and that's going to be based on a few different criteria, like recovery point objective, which would be measured as typically the time between your backup increments. It's essentially the tolerable amount of time before data might be lost. That would be a low-level goal during the recovery procedure to have everything established prior to that RPO, and you'll minimize your impact that way. another value to identify an acceptable downtime would be the recovery time objective, or RTO. And this would actually be the maximum amount of time that it would take to restore a system from backup. So if we are talking a full bare metal restore of that web server, is it going to be 15 hours? Is it going to be a full day? What's going to be that time? And does it fall in line with what our RPO is, right? Is it acceptable or realistic even to get that system fully restored and not lose any data or have financial loss there? And as part of this, based on what you see, you will identify the recovery priorities. So those critical items as far as a business function and the dependencies would be the recovery priorities there, right? You always want to start with the most critical to the least critical when you're prioritizing these things. And that's a kind of high-level overview of what a business impact analysis would entail, and you will incorporate this into the recovery plan. A lot of this information is very valuable when you actually get into defining the procedures and what the plan for your business is. So of course, as you're walking through the process of planning, you want to identify what preventative measures are currently in place. What exactly as a business are we doing today? Do we have UPSs that would allow for an appropriate runtime for server power down in the event of a building power outage? Are we using appropriate fire suppression in our data center so that if there is a fire outbreak, we can minimize the impact to the actual hardware data? Various things like that. So the prevention methods are going to really identify what is going to be necessary in the planning process. What are we doing now? What can be done? And what must be implemented? What are we requiring as an organization? If we have a web server hosting our website, are we implementing that in a DMZ? Is it firewalled or segmented from other resources, right? Do we require that or not? Is it a good idea? Is it going to impact our business in a different way? These are things that you want to identify so that you can better prepare yourself for the recovery process. Ideally, you would want to implement as many preventative measures as possible during this phase, so that you can really minimize the impact even more, or minimize the likelihood of an event occurring. And the strategy phase of the planning process is essentially where it all comes together, and you as a business will identify exactly in more detail than the policy would have outlined how you plan to, in the event of DR, recover from a major disaster. You would specify exactly, we're going to utilize this backup system, whatever provider you so choose, and it has to occur at this specific increment. We must have these amount of copies, and they must be stored in these specific ways, right? If you're an organization that needs immediate access to specific files for, in the event an employee accidentally deletes something, and want a hot storage environment for immediate restoration of small files, that's great. But as everybody else in the cybersecurity track has kind of outlined today, it's a fantastic practice to have air-gapped backups, right? So you want to have that hot storage, and you also want to have that cold storage available, and identify it as far as whether that's kept a copy in the main location, or is it going to be kept exclusively at an alternate location, significantly distanced, to minimize the impact or likelihood that those backups additionally get compromised there. But alternate sites don't just apply to backup data in this case, actually. So in the event of a business continuity plan, you would likely want to have some sort of an alternate physical site identified for the organization. Specifically in a continuity of operations plan, you would be looking at an alternate site for headquarters or office locations. But if you're a company that also has branch locations, like a bank with multiple branches in different cities, you may want to also consider fallback locations for branches that would be customer facing, as that's likely a critical function to the business, and loss of that branch location could have a significant impact to your financials. You will want to get into very specific detail about the roles and responsibilities within the organization. So not just something like the security operations manager will coordinate the plan. You would want to get more into detail as far as who is going to make certain calls, who is going to be actively doing restoration. And maybe doesn't have to be naming individuals, but again, they're the specific roles within the organization. For example, network engineers will be managing restoration of switches and endpoint equipment, or system administrators will specifically walk through the restoration of these servers. Help desk employees will walk through the restoration of these specific workstations. Identify exactly who will be doing what during these scenarios, and have proper work instructions identified for them to follow, a checklist that can be kind of marked off as you're walking through the event or walking through the incident, to make sure everything is completed according to the plan and nothing is missed there. Additionally, you can have equipment replacements identified inside of this plan. So if the business always has spare firewalls in place, live failovers potentially even, have that written, have that documented. If you don't plan to have replacement equipment readily available on site, anticipate what time it would take to actually get that equipment to you, and have that documented. Identify where you will get those equipment replacements. If you have support contracts or sales contracts with a specific business, identify those as part of the plan. And of course, you want to have cost considerations included here as well, right? So if your plan is to not have physical replacements available immediately of equipment, include the considerations for purchasing that at the time of the event occurring, how long it's going to take. But additionally, anticipate costs for the support agreements. So if you plan to utilize a third party to assist in the restoration, a managed service provider like NCI, anticipate the costs that are associated with that, and include that as part of the plan. If you plan on allowing employees to work overtime during these instances, which I assume, that's probably almost a requirement, anticipate those overtime cost considerations there. And I just need a little drink real quick. So testing and training of the plan, we kind of already talked about at a high level whether it will be required in a policy, but during the strategy implementation, you should be also defining exactly what methods of testing will be utilized. So if you're expecting a bare metal restoration of a server to occur yearly, have that specified, and make sure you specify who is actually going to be performing that, and validating that it was performed. So there should be a method of tracking that as well, a nice audit log for risk assessors or auditors to come in and validate exactly that you are following your policies and your plans in that regard. Training as well should be specific and identify exactly who needs to be trained on what. They shouldn't be, there really isn't a way to train the entire organization and have them all be ready for their role, right? You need to have role-based training implemented so that the network operations team is aware of specifically what they need to do and how they will accomplish it. For customer service representatives to understand their role and their responsibilities in the event of a security incident. Role-specific training is recommended and ideal there. And it should be, again, tracking a specific interval and audit logging of all of the training. So you can identify that, yes, everybody within the organization did accomplish their training for the year or for this quarter or for this 6 months, whatever the identified criteria is there. There should be an audit log that can validate it was completed, and a method of tracking success there as well. So just everybody completing the training might not be enough. It might be a better idea to additionally track how well they did during the training, right? So if people got a 50% on a security quiz that they did through their training, as an example, calculate that into how effective your training method is. And of course, the plan should absolutely have a review process included. This should include an oversight committee for the entire continuity or the contingency planning framework within your business. There should be a committee of various members of the organization designated to actually do these reviews and walk through the plan and identify any changes in personnel or added roles or separated roles, right? If somebody was wearing many hats initially when the plan was created, but you've since broken that role into many smaller ones, you want to actually add that or identify that in the plan. Businesses are constantly expanding and growing. That's kind of the value of them, right? You don't want to have a business that's stagnant for too long, or you might not be making a lot of money or growing. And so changes in the system, changes to the business should actually trigger a review of the process specifically. So if you've identified that annually the committee will review the process by default, you should additionally say something along the lines of, business acquisitions or business expansions will trigger a review at that time. To make sure that those systems are being properly incorporated into the plan. This committee should identify the effectiveness of the plan as well. So at a high level, they should have some criteria for measurement of the success there, and that can be defined internally in various ways. And apart from just the effectiveness of the plan, there should be a measurement of effectiveness of training and testing, and the committee should kind of review the value there, what scale you're getting out of your testing and training, and modify the requirements there accordingly. If this method of training isn't actually doing the effects that we would like to see, revisit that, find a different method, subscribe to a different service, whatever the case is. Just make sure that it is meeting your criteria or meeting your requirements and standards for what you expect out of your employees in these cases. So the big thing here, in the event of a major disaster, you absolutely need to have backups, and the business continuity plan or the business disaster recovery plan should identify exactly what your backups entail. They should identify the scope, the frequency, and the accessibility. So as we've already talked about, Does it need to be hot storage that's immediately available, and should everything be available that way? Or is there only, one server needs to be available, a file share server needs to be available for immediate restoration of small files or individual files, and then we can keep the majority of our backups offline, in a tape, offsite, whatever. Define those backups from the business perspective to make sure that all aspects of the business will be recoverable and supported by these backups. And it's important to define a specific frequency as well. So if your environment doesn't change all that regularly, do you need daily backups? Do you need weekly backups? What is the criteria there? Or if your business does change constantly, which I assume most businesses do, should you be doing more than daily backups? Should you be doing, hourly incremental? What are you looking at for a frequency? Have that defined in the plan, and make sure that your instructions and your systems are configured to meet those requirements as well. And it's important to make sure that every critical system is backed up. You might think that all of your critical data is stored on a file share, so you don't back up a domain controller. But what happens when permission groups are lost, or a DC goes down and you can't log in to actually access that file server, right? You really need to identify all of the dependencies of your business functions, and that would be done during the BIA, to ensure that they're properly scoped for the backup planning there. So what are some other considerations apart from what we've already talked about? Some things to make sure are considered as part of the plan are things like insurance, cyber liability insurance, and what your coverage all entails. Are we only covered in the event of a fire doing physical damage to our data center, or are we covered for cyber attack as well, the event of a hacker actually penetrating the environment, ransomware running rampant through the network? Are we covered in that event to either pay the ransom and not have financial loss from the organization, or cover the necessary financial costs for complete restoration of the environment? Ensure that that's identified, documented as part of your plan and your procedures. When to call an insurance provider should be included in the strategy as well, and making sure that the key exclusions within those insurance policies are well known and documented, so that you can properly prepare for the event of insurance not paying out correctly. Support contracts and agreements. So if you plan to use a managed service provider for some of your recovery process or forensics process or just general IR, what is the guaranteed response time from them? What are the expected resources availability, right? Are they going to be a 24/7 service, or is it going to be something just 8 to 5, and after 5 o'clock nothing is done and your business is just waiting until 8 o'clock the next day? Having those things identified as part of the plan, so that you can prepare and know exactly what the schedule will look like, or what the process is going to look like as far as contacting external resources. That should all be required in the strategy. For example, if a managed service provider is going to be utilized for incident response, having it included in your incident response plan when exactly to contact them, who will contact them, and what the expectations are going forward with that agreement should be absolutely defined ahead of time. Data retention policies. So backup data is great to have, and how long you have that should absolutely be defined. There's definitely some specific instances where going back just a week or going back just a month may be the preferable solution in order to minimize how much data you have to recreate or regather. But it's very important to specify what the organization may be required for as far as retention. So you might need to go back a 6-month time period. You might need to go back a year to get a good, clean copy of data, depending on how you're handling your backups. So it's important to keep the retention period specified, and make sure you're following those retention periods as well. Not just for backups, but also for event logs, audit logs, or just audit trail information, right? So like that audit trail of testing validation and training validation, how long do you keep those records to prove that you are following these procedures? And some other things would be supporting documentation. So inside of this plan, if there's a specific subset of the disaster recovery policy that references the incident response plan, have that in the section, have that outlined, and maybe even reference the specific section of the IR plan that it's talking about. So for ease of access, ease of navigation between all of your different policies and plans, so that everybody is on the same page and understands what is exactly expected by the organization. So some common mistakes that a lot of businesses make. The obvious one is not having any plan at all. And if that is you, I would absolutely recommend starting as soon as you can. Doing things like the business impact analysis to identify exactly what your critical functions and critical assets are. Then you can really start rolling out the plan, enacting the policy and requirements that the organization will have for these things. Not completing a step in this process. Some people might identify one of these steps as pointless or not really relevant to their organization. They exist for a reason, right? The steps are not something that I actually came up with at all. This is all outlined in NIST Special Publication 800-34. This will identify, or essentially that document will identify these exact same steps that we walked through in much greater detail. So if you haven't read any of the NIST documentation, 800-34 is the publication related to contingency planning. And I highly recommend it, especially if you are a late night reader before bed and you just need something to help you fall asleep. This is a fantastic read for that. Some other mistakes would be things like not testing. That is probably one of the biggest mistakes, apart from not having a plan at all, is not training and not testing. If you've never walked through exactly what your plan is, the critical times that you do walk through that plan for the first time, say it's a critical event and you're walking through your checklist and you realize, oh, that's kind of irrelevant, we don't need to do that, or this was not part of the plan but was absolutely necessary. The testing phases and the strategy or the training phases of the overall strategy and the overall plan will ensure successful completion, and actually like a valid plan and a valid strategy. So if there are flaws, these steps should catch those flaws and be able to correct them before it is a critical scenario that they are a part of. Not communicating is another major mistake, and not having a plan for communication is a major mistake, right? So in the event of a major incident, a full infrastructure outage, trying to identify exactly who the key points of contact are, or the channels of communication that can be used, is not something that should be done on the fly. It should be well defined exactly who needs to communicate with who, and how they do it in order to maximize your efficiency and minimize your impact, right? If everybody's not communicating properly, the plan is not going to be executed appropriately. And then, of course, there's the updating the plan, the regular review of what your strategy is. Not performing that allows the plan to get stale and outdated very easily. As businesses expand, it's absolutely necessary to perform the review. And if you do not, you will kind of realize that you're in one of those scenarios of a critical incident occurs, you're walking through this plan, and it hasn't been updated since 2001, right? So something like that, you're going to have some major issues as you're actually walking through and trying to perform the recovery procedures. So the closing statements that I really just want to leave you guys with here, have a plan and make sure that you properly are communicating that plan, and actively test the plan on a regular and defined schedule. Communicating the plan and having it published in a manner that all employees are required to read and sign and consent to their knowledge of. But then also just having it accessible ensures consistency and proper execution going forward whenever the plan has to actually take effect. Ultimately, you can never be over-prepared. Would I say that every organization needs to implement every single contingency plan? Probably not. Is it feasible to do that? Realistically, no. But having as many plans of action as possible will allow an organization to be very well prepared, right? You can't be over prepared for really any instance. And so the last thing there would be that the world of information security is always changing and always growing. So your organization or your security plans also need to grow and change with it. And that pretty well sums up the points that I was trying to get across during this presentation anyway. So I will open it up to some questions if there are any.
Kaiden, great job. You did such a good job. There's actually no questions right now. But I thought of
Wow.
one. I thought of one while I was sitting watching your presentation, and obviously, congratulations on the ethical hacker certification that you got. Can you explain a little
Thank
bit
you.
of what that means to yourself and Network Center?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, my undergraduate was network and security administration, so it had a pretty heavy focus on defensive and offensive uh, security practices, and that is essentially what the ethical hacker certification is focused on, is the offensive aspect of information security. So rather than being what would be called a black hat hacker and actively trying to compromise environments for financial gain or anything like that, ethical hackers actually will try and test controls for an organization, be contracted for penetration testing and vulnerability testing, etc. And that's a service that NCI is providing, and hopefully this ethical hacker certification kind of reinforces our capabilities of providing.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That ends our 3 o'clock session. We have the final session coming up with Evan. You don't want to miss that. So we'll give everybody here 10, 11 minutes to check their emails, and we'll see everybody back here at 4. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.